I want to look at two further examples of the sort of vanished American furniture, but actually, more importantly, vanished American values tied to furniture. You have to remember again, as we were looking at the earlier stuff, all this is symbolic. But before that, just sort of as something for you to think about, sort of the quote food for thought unquote category. I would put in the modern, if you were going to do a modern one, say late 20th century vanished. I would put TV trays in there. I remember those as a kid, but I don't know that they're around anymore. Maybe they are, but I bet you they're not called TV trays. And the second, I would actually put the dining room formal set. You still see dining room formal sets for sale. You can go to Inspiration and see them. But I have a sneaking suspicion they're not high on the list of things that people are buying, in what you might call sort of normative middle class homes anymore. And if they are, I suspect that people try to figure out what they're going to do with them. What I would like you guys to just sort of think about, again, no, don't bother putting any sort of response back on this, but just sort of think about if someone were to give you an assignment and actually ask you what pieces of furniture and sort of the symbolism attached to them you think are going to be vanished by 2030, what would those include? I haven't really thought about it myself, but I have some sort of vague ideas. But to sort of think about that when you're looking at these historic presentations about furniture pieces that disappeared, say, in the last 120, 140 years, and think of what, if you were doing a presentation in 2030, what pieces of furniture around in, say, 2010 have essentially vanished from the American home. So let's go back and look at our last two, 19th to early 20th century, now sort of dinosaurs of furniture. The first is moving us into the dining room. And this sort of makes sense. The dining room was a much more significant social place in the 19th century and in the 20th century, though it shifts. In the 19th century, the dining room probably was one of the greater areas of gap between what you might call middle class life and upper middle class life in the United States and in Europe. Middle class families generally had a small dining area, and it was oftentimes sort of one of the criteria for being lower middle class was the fact that you had a small dining area, versus upper class would have large formal dining rooms with massive tables and the whole 9 yards. And so the furniture in the dining room was very sort of socioeconomic class prescribed. But also, as folks start to get upward the aspirational in the 19th century, what you find is they can't really increase the size of their home. That's a late 20th century thing with the idea of suburban life. But in the 19th, early first half of the 20th century, people's homes were pretty much fixed. They weren't going to move around a lot. And so what you did is you had to change what you had in rooms because you really couldn't change the size of the room, or you couldn't change the function of the room. So the dining room set itself, the table and chairs, was pretty much fixed. What you find was the actual critical piece of furniture that actually in many ways symbolically was more important than the actual dining room table itself, since that was actually pretty functional. People used it for almost all meals, was the sideboard. And this was a fascinating piece of furniture. These have almost entirely disappeared in American society. I suspect even in antique stores, they're very, very, very rare. They were extremely heavy. They were always carved out of wood. And many of them in the United States were made in places like Ohio, stuff where you had a large German, Scandinavian immigrant population that was, basically grounded in woodworking, especially carving, when they came over here as immigrants. And so they basically continued that. And so what you find is this peculiar piece of furniture. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. Okay, so here's the side stand. These were invariably put against the wall on the sort of longitudinal or long side. So there would be this visualized, the center of the room would have a long rectangular dining table. Chairs with one end would be, I can never remember if it was north or south, but anyways, one end would be where the husband or head of family would sit, and then everyone else ranked on the other three sides. This would be on the side, the solid wall facing the dining room table on its long side. Massive pieces of furniture, extremely heavy, hundreds of pounds very commonly. This is a fairly small one. Here's a much more ornate one. One of the really striking aspects about this is much of the artwork, and let's segue back and forth, it's sort of hard to see with this one. much of the artwork on a side stand was, in less of a, for lack of a better terms, was magical. There was a huge reference, if you notice here, to food, to dead birds, to dead deer, all sorts of animals, hunting dogs. The same thing here, animals. The only thing you see occasionally now, though, it's probably disappeared in American side, would be the idea of a cornucopia. It's, I think, Thanksgiving, or I can't remember when you see them. The idea of a horn in which, food, limitless amounts of food comes out of. And that's, if you notice, that's the large part of what these things are. They were massive constructs of wood whose basic function was basically of symbolic art. And there was a sort of interesting assumption, given the fact that American society being largely Protestant Calvinist, sort of interesting to have this logic, that the artwork on the side stand or sideboard would basically help make sure that the family always had more than enough food to fill the dining room table. So it had very explicit, for lack of a better term, symbolic magical properties attached to it. In terms of functionality, it was very limited. Some of these would actually have doors that would open to hold, special plates, especially serving plates. Its main area of function was actually this flat area here, sort of a table surface. Notice both of these have that. It's sort of hard to see here. But what you would do is that's actually traditionally where you would set, maybe a Thanksgiving turkey or something like that. You'd set the main course here before you put it on the table. Other than that, this thing served no function. This was not storage behind here. There wasn't any place else to put stuff. It was just basically this enormous piece of wooden art. And that was pretty much it. As far as I know, they're very rarely painted. I've only seen a few. Antique shops. They went for a ton of money because once they became unpopular, once people weren't using dining rooms and didn't really sort of buy into this logic anymore, they got rid of these things. They were hugely heavy. You couldn't move them. They actually put strain on floors. And so they're a fascinating example of symbolic art that was very much part of the European ethos, especially what you might call Central Western European. British had these, but French, you don't see them too much, but especially Germany, Austria, Scandinavian countries, these were pretty much normative in the dining area. And so this sort of came over with that immigrant population, I think. And so by the 19th century, what you'd find is everyone had these things. You can go in the Sears catalog and you'll find sort of like small streamlined versions of these for, again, upwardly aspirational lower middle class families. And this was actually one of the major purchases of furniture in the house because these things were extremely expensive. And again, because they weighed so much, they were very difficult to move around. And so this was a piece of furniture that once people quit using the dining room for the same sort of social functions, the symbolism of this, which was pretty period based, really just sort of started to fade out. People just didn't really, buy into it, I guess, anymore. And so the end result is they vanished. So the sideboard is a fascinating example of a visual, sort of tactile, in the sense of carved symbolism that's tied directly to food, but not in terms of necessarily eating food, but in terms of providing food. And again, you have to remember, prior to the late 20th century, you didn't have grocery stores. Pretty much people bought their food every day. In a large part, even in the United States, people actually still plucked at chickens and basically prepared their food for the table. So this was a hugely important part of that whole symbolism of feeding the family. And of course, if you had a larger congregation, say some sort of a ceremony or special dinner, then of course providing enough food for everyone. Which is still, you still see this with the idea of say, going to the Cheesecake Factory and you get up with these large servings of food. Is what you might call sort of a 21st century version of some aspects of the side stand. So this was, one of those. This is the other one. And to me, this is the most fascinating one. I've actually seen these in Nevada. If you go to the Humboldt, well, I'm sure they're gone now, but if you went into the Humboldt Trace, they're doing work for the Park Service, which was the trail that folks took, the Oregon Trail that folks took to get from the Midwest to the West Coast. And a large part of that, depending on which route you took, went across the desert salt flats of northern Nevada called Humboldt Trace. And you have to remember again, everything was moved by wagon, just like you see in this image here. So, the amount of stuff you could carry was limited. Where you were going, basically, you had to bring everything with you. It was to sort of the 19th century, early 19th century version of a moon expedition. You weren't going to order it. You weren't going to get it. There was no traffic. There was no movement. And what's really fascinating is given the fact that, wagons at the time, especially if you're going cross country, were pretty much limited to about 650, 800 pounds of what they could carry. And that had to include food for animals, food for people, everything from nails to hammers to everything you're going to need for a life in the new part of the, North America. One of the things that people felt really that they had to have with them was this thing. I remember seeing at least 4 of these, and initially, we hadn't really thought about it too much. And these were abandoned in the mid 19th century when people were making it across the West, and these weren't wagons. And these were one of the things that people were loath to get rid of, but in many cases they had to because they oxen were tired, and it was either you run out of water and food or you dump this. And this was the organ, more commonly known the foot organ. This was a uniquely American thing. Brits and Europeans had organs, though in many cases they would go with maybe even an upright piano. Upright pianos in the United States, even to the late 20th century, were pretty much considered lower class. Because in part, maybe because there was no religious connotation to them. I'm not exactly sure, but the classic image of the 19th century in the United States where you'd see a piano would be a bar. You would never find an organ in a bar in the United States, at least not image-wise. But in the home, you very rarely would find a piano. You'd find this organ. And now let's segue to an image of what the organ looks like. Here's an organ here. Now, these were fascinating instruments because they really were about as non-functional as you can get. If you've ever heard it, there's a few of these still around. You basically had to pump these pedals on the bottom to put air, then blew air, then bellows, through a set of basically whistles. And once you pressed a key, it decided which whistle to use. These things sort of sound like a bunch of cats being tortured. It's almost impossible to make them sound any good. So they didn't sound good. They were not attractive. They weighed actually more than a upright piano did. So they were very, very heavy. They were totally insane to take on a wagon across the United States for settlement in a new place. But people felt they had to have them, and the reason, very simply, was that this, especially to Americans, again, Europeans have different objects, but in many cases, it'd be the piano. But in the United States, what you find, especially, I'm not sure about Canada. In the United States, what you find is the foot organ, the pump organ was another term for it, was basically the main piece of furniture in a living room, more so than a couch. So in the living room, you would have this. And what you would almost invariably have on the music stand part above here would be some sort of a hymnal that would be, religious or, socially acceptable music. Now, the interesting thing about this is in many cases, no one in the family could play it. And even if you could play a regular organ, like a real organ, playing this thing so it actually sounded any good, I would think would be equivalent to something you could do on some sort of a talent show today. These things sounded absolutely horrible. And so what's interesting is, unlike the upright piano, which, a little bit of tuning sounds good, these things, their sole function was symbolic. You weren't going to get people playing them. They weren't going to be using them. But the image was that people would play music, especially it was getting dark out. People would play religious tunes or, sort of, I don't know what you would call it, sort of, popular, but not sexy popular, like sort of folk popular tunes, very period stuff. It's really whatever the mainland version of Holly music would be here. And this would be played on here, and the family would gather around and either listen or sing along. So this thing served 2 functions. Once it was basically in many ways sort of the religious center of the house, because this would be tied. Oftentimes there'd be some sort of a stand nearby that would have the family Bible there, or the family Bible might be up here instead of the music text. But this was where people were expected to participate in semi-religious family events. So, for example, at Christmas, this is where you would sing Christmas carols and listen to Christmas music, especially semi-secret or secret Christmas music. In other events, who knows what you would use it for, in the modern sense. But its main function was to be seen. And so not having this in the house implied that you weren't religious and you didn't have good moral values. Having this in the house meant that you had to have good moral values and you were religious, in part, from the pragmatic reality that you'd hauled this sucker across half of the United States. This persists right into the early 20th century. Sears apparently sold a ton of these when Sears first starts up in the 1880s or whatever. Montgomery Ward's too. This was a very popular item where these upright, these pump organs. By 1910, they're gone. 1920, they're gone. Again, if you were to find any of these now and in decent condition, I suspect it would be worth a fortune. This again is the other sort of, in some ways, maybe the most fascinating example of vanished furniture in the American home, because it symbolized to Americans almost everything that made the American house what it was. The family gathered around singing and praying together. Someone playing the organ to, invoke both morality, religiosity, and also togetherness, especially at certain events like Christmas or coming up Easter, for example. I'm not sure if there's Easter music. I think there is. So having all this stuff, again, what you wouldn't be is you wouldn't be practicing Rachmaninoff. You wouldn't be playing Mozart. You wouldn't be playing what was considered entertainment music. It might be classical, but you have to remember in the 19th century, that was entertainment music. This was intended for spiritual functions, either family spirituality or religious-based spirituality. And it all centered around this. And so this piece of furniture was the most important piece of furniture in the living room, and probably one of the 2 or 3 most important pieces of furniture in the house. When it disappears in the early 20th century, it's saying a bunch about American society and the changing ways that people practice, for example, religiosity. As Americans settle down and move into towns, think of the Main Street, for example, religiosity moves from the organ in the house to the church services that people would have on Sunday or during religious events like Easter. So now what you do is your religiosity is public. Religiosity is done with your neighbors out in some sort of space where we'll sort of check on each other and make sure they're, quote, going to church. In this period, when you have the organ in place, you have to remember people were much more dispersed. And so you didn't generally have, for many folks, there wasn't really easily accessible churches that you would go to all the time. So the organ was basically, if you would, your church of home. And the changing dynamics of social neighborhoods, social value systems, the need to sort of fit in with the neighbors, which as Americans become more urbanized in the late 19th, early 20th century, becomes a key part. That sort of leads to the disappearance of the organ. Just about the same time as the sideboard. I think, in my personal opinion, there's different events sort of triggering this. I think what they have in common is the fact that the American view of their relationship with the world around them changes radically. And I think it's not by accident that the organ disappeared, the sideboard disappears, the headstand disappears, and along with their hall stand disappears. And along with that is the change in attitude that the front door now becomes sort of the terminus of public space. Coming through the front door means you've moved into the house, which is sort of the 20th century attitude. And I think that's because as people became more urbanized, there was a much more concern about, who all your neighbors were, and the sense of a more sort of, relaxed sense of inside and outside in the 19th century. And so the furniture that was representative of a period of time when people could sort of wander around or check out parts of your house vanishes. And so that along with that is these functions get taken over either by other pieces of furniture or literally in many cases, I would argue, move out of the house to other locations.